Ukraine says it has retaken a critical suburb of Kyiv from Russian control.
But the White House is warning Russia could take its offensive online, with the U.S. preparing for potential cyber attacks. CBS News' Debra Alfarone has the details.
FBI Director Christopher Wray is calling on business leaders to work with the FBI to prevent Russian cyber attacks.
We're particularly focused on the destructive cyber threat posed by the Russian intelligence services. We have cyber personnel working closely with the Ukrainians and our other allies abroad.
The comments come a day after President Biden sounded the alarm.
The magnitude of Russia's cyber capacity is fairly consequential, and it's coming.
Cybersecurity experts tell CBS News they're particularly concerned about potential attacks on the U.S. financial sector, power grid, and water systems. President Biden is also warning Russian President Vladimir Putin could be considering a chemical or biological attack in Ukraine, although the Pentagon says there's no evidence to suggest that such an attack is imminent. During his upcoming trip to Europe, the White House announced the president will join partners in imposing additional sanctions on Russia.
We are prepared and committed to this for as long as it takes.
New satellite images show the magnitude of the destruction in the Ukrainian port city of Mariupol. And in the city of Mykolaiv, doctors cleared the rubble from a damaged psychiatric hospital. But in Kyiv, where a curfew is in effect until Wednesday, officials say Ukraine's military has retaken a strategically important suburb, preventing Russian troops from surrounding the capital city. Debra Alfarone, CBS News, the White House.
Ambassador Alexander Vershbow joins us now. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, welcome. From the outset, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy has expressed a willingness to negotiate with President Putin. But now Zelenskyy seems open to discussing Crimea and NATO membership. What seems to be on the table?
Well, I think I would say first that while Zelenskyy clearly is interested in negotiating, there's no evidence that President Putin is serious about negotiations right now. Even though his military offensive has stalled, he may still hope that the forces can recover, that the attacks on civilian targets can wear down the Ukrainians' resistance, and that he can force Zelenskyy to kind of capitulate. So I think the first thing I would stress is what we really need to do now, and this is a subject for the summit meeting that Biden will attend tomorrow at NATO, is ramp up significantly the military support to the Ukrainian armed forces, including getting them more air defense and other systems so that we can increase the pressure on Putin to negotiate seriously. Now, in terms of what's on the table right now, I think that there's a kind of basic trade-off that seems to be developing between the negotiators. The Ukrainians would give up their ambitions to join NATO and accept neutral status, which is a very bitter pill for Zelenskyy to swallow. And this would be in return for the Russians agreeing to a real permanent ceasefire, full withdrawal of all their forces from occupied territories in Ukraine, and joining with the U.S. and other powers to provide security guarantees to Ukraine that this kind of aggression is never going to happen again. These security guarantees are the hardest part because they had some security guarantees in the 90s under a thing called the Budapest Memorandum. And of course, Russia violated that when they invaded Ukraine in 2014, and of course with this new invasion. So that's the hardest issue. There are other things that the Russians are trying to insist on. For example, that Zelenskyy recognized Crimea as Russian territory, another bitter pill. But I think the central issue is, can Zelenskyy walk away with Ukraine still a sovereign state with security guarantees, able to be confident that this kind of invasion won't happen again?
Yeah, Ambassador, I want to ask you a little bit more about that last point that you just made. I mean, Russia wants Ukraine to surrender roughly a third of its territories. Do you know what areas specifically Russia's asking for? And do you have an idea of how they want to see those regions governed?
Yeah. Well, bottom line is we don't know the details of what's going on in these negotiations. But I think that what we think Russia wants is not only, of course, to keep Crimea, which they illegally annexed, and they also want to have the so-called People's Republics in eastern Ukraine, which they occupied in 2014, but which they're trying to expand during the current military campaign. And people suspect that they want to keep some of the territories they now sort of more or less control along the Black Sea coast, particularly Mariupol and towns to the west of Mariupol, so they can have this land bridge to Crimea from the main part of Russia. I think that Zelenskyy is saying, this should not be an agreement that rewards new aggression. So going back to what the Russians had on February 23rd, before the invasion, would, for Zelenskyy, be the maximum that he could give up. But this is going to be a tough negotiation. And the West needs to throw its support to Zelenskyy in making demands for a fair deal, not something that the Russians could declare as a victory.
And Ambassador, if you could give us some background. While NATO has an open door policy, some NATO countries have opposed Ukraine joining. Remind us why Ukraine has not been admitted. And if the U.S. and NATO are funneling billions in aid and weapons to that country, why not just admit Ukraine?
Well, your last point is a good one. But allies have been reluctant precisely because of Russian sensitivities to fulfill a promise that they made back in 2008 that Ukraine and also Georgia would become members one day. It was all very vague, and in some ways, it was a decision that made the situation more difficult for Ukraine because the Russians saw them as potential members, but NATO wasn't doing anything to actually bring them in. So they were in the kind of position of maximum vulnerability. But the basic rules of the game is that NATO has an open door in the sense that countries are free to apply for membership if they are a European democracy and meet the criteria. But it's a political decision whether NATO actually admits them. And so Ukraine and Georgia have been in this kind of purgatory, neither in nor out. And the consequences of that are, unfortunately, are being felt now by the mass destruction being wreaked on the Ukrainian people.
Ambassador, do you think that what we've seen, this recent invasion, calls for any sort of re-examination of what NATO's mission is?
Well, I think NATO's founding mission, which kind of became a bit more blurred over the years as the threats began to recede at the end of the Cold War, but its basic mission has always been territorial defense of the members' territory. And I think NATO needs to go back to the basics and focus almost exclusively now on territorial defense, because we cannot assume any longer that President Putin is interested in a stable, predictable relationship between Russia and the West, and that Ukraine may just be the first step in an effort to roll back a lot of the changes that took place after the Cold War. So NATO needs to do everything it can to strengthen its force posture along the eastern borders of NATO so that the Russians won't even think about challenging NATO territory. And that's part of what President Biden has been emphasizing throughout this crisis, defending every inch of NATO territory. But to do that effectively now, it needs more forces on the eastern flank. It needs lots of investments by the allies so that this isn't just the U.S. carrying the burdens. And it required dealing with new technologies, with the cyber threats, all the different dimensions of warfare that the Russians could use against NATO as they've been using them against Ukraine.
Picking up on your point, Ambassador, over the weekend, Belarus evacuated its embassy in Kyiv. Russian forces held joint military exercises with Belarus and also launched some attacks from Belarus. Do you think this has the potential to engulf other nations?
Well, I'm not sure that it's going to spread in the short term. I think Belarus right now is taking a more cautious stance, and the Russians, who unfortunately were able to use Belarusian territory to launch part of the invasion force a month ago, I think the Russians realized that Belarus is not a particularly reliable ally. But for NATO, of course, we've seen Russia sort of effectively annex Belarus over the last year, since the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, basically became totally dependent on Putin to save his neck after the popular protests nearly toppled him at the end of 2020. And so Russia now has put troops into Belarus for the first time in decades, which now brings the threat from Russia even closer to NATO's borders than it has been. So we need to consider deterring Belarus's continued cooperation with Russia that poses a threat to NATO, even as we look at the main threat from Russia itself.
All right, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow. Ambassador, thanks very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.